This is the last presentation of the conference. Okay, the Jamel will present the last paper. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to present this paper in such interesting and high-quality conference. So this work is a joint work with Joshua Eisenman, Hirohito, Nogun Park, and Ghazi Salahuddin. So we are going to explore the drivers and the shape, the patterns of the crisis and the recovery of almost the last 30 years. And we will see that institutional development and trade restrictions play an important role in shaping these expansions and recoveries. And we will also, I will also try to convince you that global shocks have some particularities. So in this study, what we do, we analyze the patterns of recessions and recovery for around 100 advanced and developing economies. We use a statistical algorithm to identify the turning points of recessions and expansions. So what we have, overall, we validate one of the main prediction of the Friedman's plucking model of a business cycle. So deeper recessions are followed by stronger recoveries. However, there is a small nuance about that. The empirical evidence in favor of the plucking model becomes weaker if we consider the extent of the institutional development and the level, the amounts of trade restrictions. So basically, we found that recession that occurs in context of political conflict and political instability, and in the context of a high level of trade restrictions, differ sharply from those that do not have these characteristics. So something that could be interesting for policymakers is that in general, developing countries and emerging markets have a weaker institutional setting and are more prone to political instability. In the same time, they have also higher trade barriers. So in order to cushion global shocks, countercyclical monetary and fiscal policy can be helpful. So during the past 20 years, we had two global shocks. So the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and the pandemic crisis 2019, 2020. So the drivers of this recession are different, but there is a common denominator between these two crises. These two crises have a global coverage. They impacted the entire world. So we identify 419 recession in our sample using quarterly real GDP data over the period 1990-2022. We started in 1990 because if we started before, some studies started in the 60s, the sample will be too unbalanced in favor to industrialized countries. In order to make the paper more original and more contribution, because I have a lot of paper in this area of the literature, we wanted to explore, to have a granular view of the institutional setup by splitting institutional variables between political stability and legal development. So you will see that political stability, the extent of democracy, democratic accountability, and trade restrictions have have a role in explaining the shape of the recessions and the recovery patterns. So we can compare for a bunch of industrialized and advanced economies the pattern of the crisis for the GFC, the global financial crisis, and the pandemic recession. What you can see is that to recover from the shock, to recover to the pre-crisis level, it took around 2 years for the global financial crisis, and the maximum level of the recession was about 10% of GDP. For the COVID-19 crisis, things are different because the crisis was stronger, so the maximum fall in outputs are around 20%, but the recovery was quite fast, 1 quarter or 2 quarters. Okay? If you look at some main emerging markets, what you can see is that, in fact, the global financial crisis, GFC, was less intense for emerging markets. For example, GDP has not fallen in China or in Indonesia. On the contrary, during the COVID-19 crisis, emerging markets experienced very strong recessions. And you can notice that the first emerging market to enter into a recession is China, because the COVID-19 started from China. If you focus on some countries in Asia, again, a similar pattern, the more heterogeneity during the GFC, but during the COVID-19 crisis, almost all the countries have known a fall in their GDP. So we have mainly two, not only, but mainly two distinct models for economic recessions. So we have the Hamiltonian recession, where the recession destroy human capital and prevents to going back quickly to a pre-trained crisis for the GDP. And you may have known about, of course, the hysteresis dynamic scarring the economy for the long run, in the long run. In this case, of course, fiscal policy and monetary policy have to be very active to help to come back to the pre-trend crisis for the GDP. You have another kind of model, which is due to Milton Friedman. It has been called the plucking model. So we took this metaphor in the literature due to Kolchin, Mosner, and Ries. So like a guitar string, the harder the economy is plucked down, the stronger it rebounds. Yeah? So even in the Hamiltonian case, loss of unemployment and welfare may be seizable, so the responsible of a policymaker should react to this type of crisis. There is an additional model, but I will come back on that later in the discussion. So, what we have, we proceed in two steps. First, we try to establish a model, a panel logit model for the determinant of the recessions. And we split between the legal development and the political stability using the ICRG data. We also include the aggregate trade restriction because of the context of the Trumpian context, if I may. So, this graph have been made before the conflict between Israel and Iran, so I would like to precise that. But what you can see here is that, in fact, for Israel, the institutional development is quite different from the political stability. So in the case of some emerging markets, the institutional development, the legal development can differ from the political stability. Yeah? So that's why we wanted to have this granular view of institutions in emerging markets. So first, the regression results from the panel logit models. Standard results in line with the literature, higher government the debt level, budget deficit, excessive credit creation, imports of energy, greater exchange rate market pressure are associated with a higher probability of a recession. In order to mitigate homogeneity, we took these determinants 1 year before the crisis. Somehow counterintuitive, trade restrictions are associated with reduced length for the recession. We will see come back why. Second, we have some heterogeneity in our sample if we group the country on a geographical basis. So first, a result. So here you have a marginal plot. On the horizontal axis, you have the political stability. So a higher score means a higher political stability. And on the vertical axis, you have the effect of the probability of a recession. So what we have here is something that we underlined with some work with Joshua and Ghazi about the buffer effect of international reserves. So IR is holding of international reserves. So it means that you can benefit from this buffer effect only if you have a high political stability. So it may be interesting for policymakers to know that if the country is not sufficiently stable in terms of its political environment context, it will not enjoy the macroeconomic stabilization property of having higher reserves. So the opportunity cost change. Somehow maybe marginal, but maybe interesting. A higher financial development increase the probability of a recession when political stability is very low. So when the country is subject to political instability, higher financial development, we took the IMF indexes by Sviridzenka, is associated with a higher probability of entering into a crisis. More interesting results, if you adopted inflation targeting 1 year before the crisis, and the political stability is very low, you have a higher probability of having a crisis. So inflation targeting is not associated with a crisis when the environment, the political stability is very high. But when the political stability is low, when you have an unstable political environment, adopting inflation targeting may increase the probability of a crisis. So it somehow relates to when you have to adopt the fiscal rule, when you have to adopt the inflation targeting regime may matter. Okay, what about trade restrictions? So MATR is an aggregate trade restriction coming from Estefania Flores. Again here, if you have a lot of trade restriction, like India or Brazil, having additional international reserves will not help you to reduce the probability of having a crisis. But if you are open to trade, having additional holding of international reserve may help you to reduce the probability of entering into a crisis. For the inflation targeting regime, when you adopt the inflation targeting regime and you have a high aggregate number of trade restrictions, it increases the probability of entering into a crisis. Countries with, in our sample, countries with the highest level of trade restriction are Brazil and India. Yeah? And countries with a lower level of political stability are Iran and Israel. Yeah? Give you some case studies. So, basically, we have identified the main drivers for the probability of entering into a crisis. As you have understood, our explained variable is a dummy variable of you are in a crisis or not. Yeah? So, basically, There is some novelty here because, in fact, the stabilizing property of international reserve that we explored extensively with my co-author seems to be here when the political environment is stable, but not when it is unstable environment. So we have a Vox column with Joshua and Ghazi about that. So when the trade restrictions are too high, when the political environment is too unstable, macroeconomic variables are not sufficient to ensure stabilizing property. So the model is more complex, and it's not an economic model. It includes also political dimensions. Okay, so now, second step. We want to see if basically having a deeper recession induce a stronger recovery. So what we saw is that for the whole sample, we have around 340 observation, 3,400 observation and around 400 recessions, something like that. We find that the plucking model, one of the plucking model was prediction is true. So that's a good point for Friedman. But we have a small nuance here. That's the originality of the paper. If the country faces to political instability and has a higher number of trade restriction, it will now enjoy a full recovery after the recession because the environment will not be able to provide such an opportunity for firms to export more. Yeah? So the plucking model is true at the global level, less relevant for an emerging market facing political instability. I don't know if Korea is an emerging market, but they faced political instability. Yeah. Weak institutions. Korea seems to have good institutions. The outcome seems to indicate that. And extensive trade restrictions. So our contribution is that we need to have a more nuanced view about this prediction of Milton Friedman, especially in the context of emerging markets. We believe that it is true, novel in the literature. So we have this picture. I don't know if I have time because the timer is not, I don't know, I still have time?
You have about 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. So basically, I can continue because this was the version if I didn't have time, so I can continue a bit. Okay, so for example here, schematic view of a business cycle, of course, you have a peak, and the extent of the recovery is computed as the difference between a recovery after 4 quarters and the lowest point of a recession. Yeah? Or you can have a recovery 8 quarters after the recession, and you subtract the lowest point. So we have a recession, and what you can see is that 1/3 of a recession occur during the 2 global shocks. So during the GFC and during the pandemics. What I can show you is, so what we do here. Here we try to see if the length, the depth of a recession, so for example, if you remember the slides, the graph at the beginning of the presentation, during COVID you may have a fall of the GDP by 20%. So if this recession is high, has a high value, is strong, what will happen to the recovery 4 quarters after the start of the recession? What you can see here is that if you are in a highly stable political environment, a stronger recession by -1%, you multiply by the coefficient that you have on the vertical axis, and you will see that the elasticity, if you want, the plucking model elasticity is 0.9 and significant. But when the political stability is very low, unstable environment, you may have a very strong fall in the GDP, but the recovery will not be affected by so you're pushing the string, and the string somehow does not rebound. Yeah. What about the length of a recession? Which is, here we try to provide some evidence about the Hamiltonian model. Do a recession that lasts more, produce a weaker recession, a weaker recovery, sorry. It seems to be true for intermediate level of political stability. Yeah? So it's not so clear here. If I still have time, I can show you also the results for the trade restrictions. Oh, yeah, thank you so much, Yuan. So here, if you have a stronger recession and a low number of trade restrictions, the recovery will be stronger. But as soon as you look in the data and you increase the level of trade restriction, this rebound effect weakens. Yeah? About the length of a recession, do the length of a recession are associated with lower or weaker recovery? It seems to be the case only for only when the trade restrictions are high. So our message here is, it's quite obvious, but you need to provide some evidence about that. If you are politically stable, if you have a few trade restrictions, the plucking model will describe your pattern of your recession, especially if you have the COVID recession. But if you are not in this setting, and it is the case for many emerging markets, emerging countries and developing countries, you will not, the plucking model will not correspond to the pattern of, that's not the right model, you need another model. Yeah. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamel. And the discussion will be followed by Xu Tian from ADB.
Thanks, moderator. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to discuss this paper. My name is Xu Tian. Let me start with a quick summary of this paper. This paper is very nicely written. It examines the drivers of recessions and recovery patterns of 110 advanced and developing economies between a relatively long sample period, which ranges between 1990s and 2022. And then it used a BB algorithm to identify the turning points to separate recessions and economic recoveries or expansions. The key findings basically are summarized as follows. So deeper recessions are followed by stronger recoveries. This is in line with existing Friedman's model. And then the authors further investigate how these recovery patterns might vary with different type of country-specific attributes, which they focus on institutional development, trade restrictions, and political uncertainty. So basically, they found that such a recovery pattern, which described above, will be weakened if a country has a relatively weak institutional environment, and then where the trade restriction is high. And then also, they found the recovery pattern can be very different following the recessions related to geopolitical or political tensions and trade tensions. So I would say these findings are very relevant, especially in the current international environment. And then it's particularly relevant for developing countries where institutional development is relatively weaker compared to advanced economies. And then especially in a time when the trade barriers are fragmentation around the world becomes more intensified. So the authors conclude that developing countries in the current situation where the trade barriers is high might want to consider counter-cyclical monetary and physical policies to cushion the adverse impacts of global shocks to sustain their growth. So I personally feel this paper is very well written, very easy and clearly presented. And then it's highly relevant to boost economic resilience in developing countries, especially in the current global situation. And then I particularly like the way the authors summarize the related literature and then also smartly link to the institutional ownership, political tensions, and the trade tensions. I think that is a very new angle to add to this literature. On top of that, I do see that the authors are able to draw very targeted policy implications based on the findings on the role of political stability and trade restrictions, how they may affect the recovery patterns after recessions. Having said that, I do have some specific comments, which is really more to share with authors from a reader's perspective. I hope the authors might wanted to help me to clarify and then maybe further improve in the paper. So some of the results, when I read the tables in the paper, I do find some of the results is not very intuitive. For example, there are a table which shows evidence that higher trade barriers is related to shallower recession. So that means if you are relatively close the economy and your recession could be less during the GFC period. And also another table shows higher trade restrictions or trade barriers is related with shorter recessions. So it seems that trade restriction might be good for some countries because they lead to shorter and shallower recessions. I'm not sure about that. But I think this definitely worth further investigation. And then my suggestion is such findings could be reasonable during the pandemic. For example, when during the pandemic, it's more that the supply chain is sort of disrupted due to the mobility restrictions. And then during such a situation, it could be true that a relatively closed economy, which do not rely on trade that much, might suffer less compared to a more open economy. But I'm not sure if whether these findings will hold during financial market related a recession. So the authors might wanted to separate such findings to see whether some big picture environment like pandemic or GFC might play a role in such inconsistent or counterintuitive findings. Hopefully, it might help to tease out a better or clearer storyline that is on the inconsistent results in some tables. And then this actually gave me further thoughts on another suggestion. So actually, the authors conducted recessions and recovery identification over a relatively long sample period, which covers GFC, pandemic, and other sample period, which may fall off small up and downs in the during the sample period. And then it might worth that the authors clarify a little bit what the GFC and pandemic and maybe some other small up and downs mean, and how that would affect the results. For example, the authors extensively discussed the GFC and the pandemic as a background or motivation, but actually in the empirical setup, the role of GFC and pandemic is not very clearly focused. So there is no a specific test to show in an environment where liquidity is an issue like GFC, taper tantrum, or in an environment where there is a trade-related disruption like pandemic. So I think it might be worthwhile for the authors to separate the samples to see how different types of large shocks might affect the findings. And then I hope this kind of analysis might help to align some of the findings. I do see liquidity-related shocks and disruption-related shocks like the current geopolitical tensions, which might disrupt the transport of oil, pandemic definitely. So I think these are two different types of shocks might worth to examine separately. I hope that might align some of the results and then better explain the findings. And then another technical issue I observed is I really like the way that you are able to identify recessions and recoveries. And then you also show to the readers about the depth of the recessions, the length of the recessions, and then how long it takes to recover. For example, you have two key variables being recoveries after 4 quarters, recoveries after 8 quarters, and then I pasted the two charts below in the current slides to show that it seems most of the recessions last, say, less than 5 quarters, and then many of them, it seems to happen during the GFC and pandemic, but there are some recessions happens, not evenly, but widely spread across the sample period. So my question is, would some of the recovery period, like 4 to 8 quarters, overlap with the next recession? So maybe a small recession, and then after it takes long, it is recovered soon. But if some recessions last longer, and then maybe during the next 4 to 8 quarters, another recession happens. So how would that kind of overlap during the recovery period affect your results? So how frequent is the recessions, and then how about overlapping situation? If there is some special explanation or clarification on those kind of possible overlapping issues, it might be help to clarify such inquiries from the reader's perspective. I think that is generally my key comments to this paper, but overall, I enjoy reading this paper a lot. I think it has real implications for policymakers. I hope the authors good luck with their journal publication. Thanks. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Jamel and Xu, for your presentation and discussions. And my apologies for to the audience because I just noticed that I restarted the session a little bit earlier than scheduled. So I'll try to give more time to the audience for the Q&A. Yeah, so now I'll try to correct some questions and comments from the floor. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. And I also agree with the discussion on distinguish the nature of the shock. You focus a lot on GFC and the COVID shock. So before the COVID shock, we tend to think, for example, monetary policy is we bypass supply shock. because we think these are divine coincidence, moving output gap and inflation in the same direction. So we learned a big lesson after the COVID. So like a shell, we bypass this supply shock. So I raised that question because it reflects the focus on GFC and COVID may be just reflecting different nature of the shock. So maybe you can utilize different episodes instead of these episodes. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jamel, I just want to follow up on Anne's point. I think one way to do it would be, if possible, to, I don't know to what extent you can do it, just split demand-driven from demand and supply-driven, which is essentially the GFC and the COVID, which is a combination of the two. And then redo the analysis by the two types, so demand-driven and demand and supply-driven, or just, because it's usually less common just supply-driven. But, and then you could have more tailored policy implications on the different marginal effects, just to add into Anne's point.
And yeah, Jamel, can you address the question?
First of all, thank you, Shu, for your very interesting comments, and thank you for the question and the suggestion by Anne and by Joao. So, for the first comment about the slightly, the counterintuitive result that we found, while it is true that GFC is demand-driven and COVID is supply-driven, something that is sometimes overlooked by macroeconomists, not by international trade economists, is that during both this recession, these global shocks, we have a collapse of trade. So in both cases, the trade collapse, and we have a V-shaped recovery for trade. So, of course, the trade collapse may be not similar, but at least you have a trade collapse in both instances. So that's also a common denominator between the both crises. So, for example, we had in the appendix, maybe it's in working paper, not in the version that we sent, but we had some regression for developing versus emerging markets. And what we saw, we used the excessive credit measure from the BIS. And what we saw is that during GFC, for advanced economy, it was a very good predictor of the probability of entering into a crisis. So we had a lot of, maybe we should put them into appendix more clearly. So, and in the same time, the GFC recession was not so much spread into emerging markets. It was very short. And so I take your comment. I would say, yes, it's bizarre to have a shorter recession and having, so maybe it's a problem of interpretation of which country has been impacted by the GFC, which has been much more severe for the advanced economies and highly financialized economies. But we are going to work on that, and we are going to discuss with the co-author to see if we can have a more convincing interpretation. So what I would say is that the level of financial development is very important. Probably if you have trade restriction, but in the same time you have a capital account restriction, it may play into a non-linear pattern, meaning that you will be protected by the trade collapse because you don't have a financial volatility. But if you have both, it will be a problematic. But so I agree with you. It's a bit counterintuitive, but I would nuance that by saying maybe the differences into the financial development may explain this bizarre result because it acts like an isolation from the trade collapse that we observed during GFC and more you're right, it's more describing a supply-driven recession and during COVID. So we are going to do that and doing maybe different subsample exercise. We can do that. We have the codes, everything is ready to do that. So we're going to explore and hopefully the results will be stable. We will see, but we will see. We cannot guess before running the code. So I get your point about being more clearly distinguished with two types of crisis, which is populate 1/3 of a recession. So we cannot ignore your point, Shu. About the overlapping, the way in which we are computed the recoveries, what you are describing is a case of a double dip recession. It means that you have a recession and then you will have in the future a double dip recession. We have that because if you look at, it's in the slide, sometimes you have a recovery after 8 quarters which is negative. It means that you have a double dip recession, so we remove the double dip recession and we test and everything is fine. So we have over the 490 cases of recession, we have 15 cases of double dip recession. One of them is Ukraine, starting from 2015. Yeah. So that's a very good point. At the time, I think it's Hirohito told me that you should check that. So you have the same comment that Hiro. So thank you very much, Shu. We are going to try to improve the paper in the direction that you mentioned. I think that's very good. If I may answer to the question from the floor. And I think the comment of Anne and Joao are quite similar, distinguishing the nature of the shock, supply-driven, demand-driven, and the configuration for the policymaker, because volatility of output was much lower before the GFC. So recession, if you have a recession at that time, it means that you are not be very skillful, or the economy have very big problems. And after the GFC, you have a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty. So maybe economies which are more fragile are more susceptible to enter into a recession, more than before when things were more stable, and the divine coincidence thing could help us to frame more of the narrative. So I fully agree with both comments. We are going to try to group them and try to improve the narrative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
If I may, just to follow up question. So in addition to maybe split the source of the shock in driving the recession, I think running panel logic models may miss a key element that you do some separate analysis, which is duration. So I would encourage to do some survival analysis, some Cox survival analysis to add to that, and also split by the intensity of the recession. I mean, because you have, of course, you have a concentration on those two, GFC and COVID period, but lunch hour summers, protracted recessions, and that discussion, I think it's absent from this, and so you can discuss and not treat all the 400 and something recessions as equal, because one is a mild recession, the other one could be a protracted big recession. That's it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Jamel, do you have any last words to?
Yeah, I can answer. Thank you very much. I think that's we actually we wanted to make a local projection because we fear that we cannot access to the conference because it seems that we need to make a local projection with a logit model, but then we change our mind because the paper was already very long. But I think survival analysis, I think both comments are quite interesting because you can make survival analysis with the big crisis too. You can mix them. I like that. We are going to discuss with the team and see if we put that, but it could be interesting to see the duration models, and I think you can also make nice interaction terms. I think I saw that in a paper about inflation duration. So yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I think we already earlier than the schedule, but I know that many of you are from the different time zone and you may suffer from the jet lag. So it's better to close this session a little bit earlier so that you can have a full rest. And we also have another chance to have chat at the dinner time. So yeah, this is the end of the session 5. Thank you. And please join me to give the big hands to our presenters and the discussant. Thank you.